segmental distances using also PMI based on the co-occurrence of the segments. So if in the dialects some segments are co-occurring more often, then that means they tend to be more similar. And this has also been used, and apparently the explained variance when you compare it to the perceptual distances of dialects increases by 1 point something percent. So it improves it a bit if you add more fine-grained distances between the segments. But in my data, I tried to apply the PMI method to find the segmental distances. But it didn't work too well because these segmental distances don't make sense if you try to plot them into two-dimensional space, or even higher, I guess. So that's why I'm using Levenshtein distance or just binary comparison instead of the more fine-grained segmental distances. But thank you for the suggestion.
About automatization, you're told that it's possible to try to automatically calculate some things. What do you have on the input? For example, just the speech recordings or prepared data. Your data, they are all from the dialect surveys or the journal articles, which are all printed on books. So these are all transcription data. It's not based on acoustic data. So I have no recordings because, usually dialect surveys were done back in the days before speech recorders, right? So tape recorders, sorry. So that's why they're all just transcription made by people going to the field and do impressionistic transcription of speech. Word elicitation, I will send some links. I proposed in my dissertation some methods how to work with speech and with spontaneous speech and obtain some distances between dialects.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. Yeah, please do. Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And I wanted to say that I'm very much attracted by this idea of comparing dialectal variation in different parts of the world, which you suggested. But I wonder whether we really can do it if we are looking at the completely different phenomena, right? So, can we really compare tones in Asian languages to, I don't know, what vowels in European and have opinions on the difference between the variation of dialects? I'm not sure. What do you think about it?
Thank you very much. That's a really good question, I think. So, yeah, it's difficult. But I guess what we could do as a first step is just, well, firstly, we need to obtain data or digitize more data. And then just to see whether we see this tendency of having dialect continue everywhere and try to see whether we can explain them. And then, yeah, in terms of you're suggesting comparing tonal variation with the vowels, right? Is that what you're suggesting? I thought that was something you were trying to do. Comparing tones on the one hand with something different in other languages. No. Okay, that's not exactly what I meant. What I meant was we're basically applying the same method so that these, at least visualizations and results, is comparable. But I don't mean you necessarily need to compare the same, different levels. Because if you don't work with the same area or data set, it's difficult to compare different levels. For example, if you talk about vowels and I talk about tones, it's more difficult to make comparison because they're just different linguistic levels. But if we talk about tonal variation in, for example, the Cantonese area versus tonal variation in South America, for example, then that would be something interesting to explore. Because firstly, they're on the tonal level, but there are different types of tones. Because in South America, they have, I think, the registered type of tones, and in Southeast Asia, they have the contour tones. So they have different typology of tones. So that would be something more closer but different to explore. But in terms of tones and vowels, I think of different areas that might not be comparable, I think. So if we're trying to compare different areas, maybe choose segments to segments or morphosyntax to morphosyntax instead of tones to vowels, for example. That's at least how I would see it. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. So, if you compare different areas, you cannot compare vowels with tones, but only within one linguistic area, like for the Euro area. We're really interested if different linguistic levels would have the same pattern. So tones and segments, we also did that with the other countries with syntax, morphology, and phonetics. And we see that, yeah, we always get best results with phonetics. And yeah, the most variation actually lies there. And then also, I mean, we can, for some areas, we can just forget about consonants. So we see that vowels are really the best source of variation at the dialectal level. But yeah, comparing different areas, I mean, that's not. So there is a big project now in Leiden about comparing about the tones in Asia and in Bantu languages. But this is really kind of pure theoretical linguistics project. But we also hope to get some insights there. So if we can even compare those tones. So they're so different. And yeah, once they do some kind of theoretical linguistic investigation, then we can see if we can compare them. But it's also kind of, we still don't know. So we're waiting for them to finish that project within a few years.
So we're really interested in the patterns of evolution, of dynamics, of how they develop, if they're like these very areas with reserved features. So were they behind the mountains? Normally, yes. So these kind of patterns we compare across different regions, but not really like anything like more specific linguistically. So only the main patterns of evolution.
Thank you. This is not my main question, but it's a small follow up to this discussion right now. So, how do we know what is different domains or same domains and what is comparable or not? For instance, you were talking about not being disposed to compare tonal systems and vowel systems. But what do you think about comparing vowel systems with and without secondary articulations like pharyngalization or nasalization? Are they directly comparable to the same extent as plain vowel systems, like without secondary articulations? Or are we sure that we make a legitimate comparison between systems with, say, 7 vowels and 3 vowels?
So this is, again, it's not obvious, at least at first point. They might be more comparable than tonal systems, vowel systems between themselves. But it's not obvious to me where's the limit of comparability, let's say, of systems. But that was just a small follow-up, if I will be permitted to ask more questions later. Thank you. Yeah, I think what you're suggesting here seems to be more with the phonological comparison rather than phonetic comparison, which is what we're doing.
And yeah, I don't think there's a lot of work being done in terms of comparing phonological systems because the methods that I've been introducing, they're all focusing on phonetic comparison. And I think in dialectometry, if you want to compare phonology, then you need to turn them into features first. And then you do the distance calculation. I'm not aware of any studies that compare phoneme systems. No, I'm also not. So I mean, it would be great if you could.
Yeah, I just wanted to be more precise. What I meant was not phonological comparison, but phonetic comparison as you do. And what I meant is that in a system with 7 vowels or more, there is simply more space for phonetic variation across the lexicon than in systems, in poorer systems. And same with secondary articulation. So it was not immediately obvious to me that it's fully legitimate to compare systems. I mean, I'm not saying it's not, but it's something to think about whether the results and methods of phonetic comparison of richer systems should be the same as poorer systems. That was simply because there is more space for variation across dialects. Yeah, so we do see these problems at different levels.
And also, what's the biggest problem here? It's like a one-way street. So the weights, the distances from one system to the other are different because simply one has more variation. And we have addressed that. That has been addressed before just by using this kind of association measures to try automatically to infer like how closely related they are. But yeah, that's the only way now that it's dealt with. So it does happen that, I mean, some systems simply have more variation than the others. But the biggest problem is that it's not kind of symmetrical. And then, well, all the statistical methods kind of, yeah, they don't like it. They prefer if it's symmetrical, it's easier. So we did try calculating different association measures from one system to the other, but it's kind of still not a resolved problem.
Yeah. I think as much systems you're able to combine, it would be better to get a real difference, real, obtain real distance between the languages you are. Yeah, we also see in perception. So if you look at how, Danish and Swedish, Danish do understand Swedes, but the other way around, it's not. So we always kind of, if you just look at that, it's clear, it's not symmetrical. And yeah, it's something that we try to deal with, but it's still kind of not really kind of solved. It's a challenge, a big challenge. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, so it was not very clear to me how to integrate the comparison of non-cognate part of lexicon into this comparison. Because if you're aiming, that depends on what you're aiming at. If you aim at mutual intelligibility, then non-cognate elements of lexicon obviously very strongly contribute to non-intelligibility. If you are trying to compare divergence, also non-cognate lexicon assumably is a sign of stronger divergence than simply phonetic divergence. So I can't really imagine what type of aim should be pursued to only pay attention at phonetic distances without taking into account lexical, non-cognate lexicon. That was my first question. And of the others that survived, I think the only one is that, yeah, the main question, you were presenting the talk. So the storyline was like, you know what happens, or we think we know what happens in European languages. So let's look at Southeast Asia and see whether the same thing happens there. And what I missed in this problem setting was that what would you expect? So, what was the alternative or null hypothesis in this comparison?
So, oh yeah, I'll address your first question first. So yeah, I think if you really want, like, of course, if we exclude all the non-cognate, then we're still throwing out some data away, right? So ideally, we would like to do a first, for example, firstly do a lexical analysis first, just to see whether there are cognates and non-cognates, just to see on the lexical level how different or similar dialects are first. And then we move on to the phonetic level. But then I think even on the phonetic level, there are different ways to calculate phonetic distances. And the way that I did it is one of the ways to just look at cognates. But I think previously there are also approaches where they put the non-cognate in it, in the calculation for the Levenshtein distance as well. And that's also possible. And for example, this has been done in, I think, the 2007 paper on the LAMSIS data in the US. And I guess you just need to compare all three analyses and see what's going on and whether they are similar or not. But I don't think this is possible for my data set because as you saw earlier, okay, I guess it's written in Chinese. It's hard to see the dialect surveys, they are monosyllabic. They only provide monosyllabic words. And at least half of the dialects don't have the lexical items, and they don't have the cognates included in the dialect survey. So I can't do any lexical analysis, sadly, so it's not possible for my data set. But for other data sets, for example, especially European languages, Western European languages, which are really well documented, then such an analysis might be possible. So these are two dimensions of comparison. It's certainly obvious how to weigh them in together, but they both should be taken into account in some way. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. When I worked with spontaneous speech, I collected some dialects myself in field work. So I decided to, of course, if it's spontaneous speech, it should contain all the dialects people are using. But anyway, I spoke with people on additional topics to have more traditional lexics inside. So no, it makes more sense to have a bigger part of traditional lexics.
I totally agree. Yeah, if possible, of course, if the data is available, of course, we'd like to take account of that. But yeah, it really depends on data availability, and definitely it's worth exploring more with the lexicon. Well, for all the linguistic levels, of course, not just the lexicon and phonetics. But yeah, if possible, yeah. Yes, I just want to add that this automatic cognitive detection is still very difficult.
So we really try to stay away from it when we can, because that's always gives very automatically does give pretty bad results. I mean, although I mean there's some kind of advances, it's still kind of in the end, it's the human expert that has to kind of judge if it's cognate or not. So if we can, we try to stay away from it and then keep it clean at the phonetic level, whatever morphological level.
And then, yeah, I mean, you can add this level, of course, as a separate level for cognates, non-cognates. But if you work with one kind of smaller area, then it doesn't really bring much. It's more kind of people interested in historical linguistics than typology than us. I mean, it would be great if we could do it, but still not automatically. It's still very difficult to do the automatic cognitive detection. Thanks.
And your second question was about what to expect if we don't see a dialect continuum. And yeah, so I mean, since the 19th century, people have been arguing about whether dialects form dialect areas or dialect continuum. And I think this is basically where we're trying to get to, whether we see the continuum pattern versus the area pattern, where we see really abrupt boundaries between different dialects. And yeah, basically, this is what we're trying to get at. And even though we don't see it at the segmental level, we might see it on the tonal level, right? I mean, we didn't explore this, but yeah, I mean, that's basically what we're trying to expect, whether we're finding a continuum or abrupt dialect areas. That's basically it, because it's a century-old question. Yes, but your map, if I remember correctly, was discontinuous in a sense.
If I may have one small question yet, this is something which bothers me in our project, is that when you take in hundreds of features, like from the traditional atlases, you may suspect that some of the features are correlated at the linguistic level and not at the dialectal divergence level. And so we never figured out how to choose this, actually. So do you have any idea how to, or maybe you could give us references to work with, discuss this, and solve this problem? I made an example there which is not valid, actually, about chain shifts.
It's not relevant for this question, but still, we can imagine. Just to give an example, if we're comparing, if we have one feature like VUV pattern and another adjective, noun, noun, adjective pattern, we know in principle from typology that these two features are correlated independent of geography or divergence, right? So they are kind of linguistically internally correlated. And if we put them together as independent features, that would kind of boost a signal from the same divergence pattern or the divergence kind of parameter that we're observing in the languages.
So how do you deal with this problem? Yeah, so if I may, so this is more kind of the studies I did with typology. So they kind of more have these problems. In the end, what we did, I think in all the analysis, we kind of removed those because they really distort the signal. So if you have those dependent features, they will really boost the signal a lot. And then we normally kind of go for one of the features because that's representing one phenomenon. So this was the solution. So at the moment, I don't know any better solution, honestly.
So it's not the perfect one, but we thought it's just not including some of the dependent features would actually be kind of more fair comparison. But it's a huge problem. So especially, typological type of quantitative studies have to deal with this all the time. We don't have to so much, luckily. But yeah, I know it is a big problem. Yeah, because it will boost the signal. So if you don't have independent feature, like in non-phylogenetic studies, you're kind of cheating. Yeah. And for the dialectometry, you don't really face this kind of problem. We don't really face. So we kind of, that's the nice thing about, because especially if you work at the phonetic level, so you're just interested.
Yeah. Well, it's not also completely. It's not true that it's not. So we did have for example, the Bulgarian data, we did have that its reflexes. We did mark all the reflexes of some proto sounds in altered Slavonic. And then we could see that they're kind of giving always the same pattern. So then we would just kind of also choose some of them. But that's something that you cannot do automatically. You really need an expert in that to kind of do kind of historical linguistic analysis and to say, these are all the reflexes of this that occur in this environment. And if you really collect those columns, basically those word positions, you would see that I have really, really nice pattern.
They're really overlapped. So in that case, yeah, you can also kind of remove them. But automatically, yeah, we just kind of keep them in dialectometrical analysis. For typological analysis, I always actually had to remove those really dependent features, like if this, then that, or yeah. But it's a notorious problem. So it's not solved.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm talking about this kind of quantitative typology. And I know this was always popping us as a problem, kind of, yeah, what do we do with it? So, yeah, it's a known problem.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions or comments, then we can thank each other for the constructive debates.
Thank you very much and see you next week. Thank you for the invite.